So let's start. Welcome to this session of our seminar cycle on Rethinking Luhmann in Socio-Legal Research. We already had 4 sessions in August. We will have now 4 sessions in September and more 3 days in November. We would like to thank FAPESP and CAPES for the funding of this event, to thank Professor Celso Campilongo for all the support in the organization of this seminar cycle, and to invite all of you for the next session tomorrow and for the next week on Thursday and Friday. Today we will have 2 lectures because Professor Cícero Krupp couldn't be with us. He will speak in a session in November. So today the first speaker is Professor Bettina Lange, Associate Professor of Law and Regulation at the University of Oxford. She will bring a socio-legal view on the relation between law and science, starting with a non-systemic approach, but at the end highlighting some points for we to think about in a systems theory perspective. And the second speaker of tonight, of this evening, Minhoto, from the Department of Sociology at the University of São Paulo. Professor Laurindo Minhoto is also the leader of a research group on systems theory and the critique of society. And today we will present some reflections about a critique of the academic capitalism from the perspective of systems theory. So we will have both lectures, about 40 minutes, and then we open for the questions for the audience. So please, Professor Bettina.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Boa tarde. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this very interesting whole series of seminars on Luhmannian perspectives for inviting me and for providing opportunity to contribute to the discussions. As you already mentioned, the talk today is not so much focused really on Luhmannian ideas. I'd like to talk more widely about the relationship between law and science, and that is based on a literature review that I conducted, and as well on some empirical socio-legal research project that I'm currently involved in. And in fact, that I'm involved in with a group of researchers from the Center for Socio-Legal Studies. So I'd like to mention here, of course, as well the other collaborators, Dr. Owen Johnston, Dr. Kevin Gregsch, and Dr. Christine Kück, who in various important ways contributed to this endeavor in collecting data and contributing to the literature review. So the title of my talk tonight is Regulating Uncertain Futures, Law and Science. And I promise this won't be a talk about the consequences of a potentially no-deal Brexit. What I actually want to do is, first of all, in the first part of the talk, say a few things why I think this is a really interesting and timely moment to think again about a very established field of research around the idea of law and science intersections. I think we're living at the moment some very turbulent, interesting times that raise again, I think, important questions around the law-science relationship. And so I'll do that in the first part of the talk. In the second part of the talk, as I mentioned, I will then come on to discuss some findings from a critical review of academic and more practitioner-oriented literature on the relationship between law and science, and in particular on how scientific evidence may inform the development of public policies and the taking of regulatory decisions. And my main argument really is going to be that I'll say that we should think about evidence, scientific knowledge being constructed in networks of organizational actors. And then in the third part of the talk, I'm going to come on to illustrate these points in more concrete detail with references to some examples from that project on managing water resources in the United Kingdom. So I think at the moment we're living in interesting times because I think we see an interesting tension between, on the one hand, discourses of uncertainty discourses of uncertainty really on what that relationship is between law and science in the making of public policy, taking regulatory decisions. And I think these discourses of uncertainty raise three interesting social-legal research puzzles. And this is really on why, despite the plethora really of scientific knowledge as well that we're having, that we're continuing to develop, that we still have unintended consequences of regulatory law, and that we have as well things like regulatory failure. So to just give some examples of the kind of regulatory failures as well that we currently have, very saliently, we have a significant problem with local air pollution in a number of different cities in the United Kingdom, in Germany as well, in other European cities, despite some EU environmental legislation on that as well. And there's a problem really in terms of the regulatory failure of properly matching up the air quality plans that we're having to achieving at the end the specific regulatory objectives of limiting in particular excessive emissions from diesel car engines in our cities. We also have plenty of examples for having regulatory provisions that lead to unintended consequences. For example, we find as well recently in the United Kingdom, in a country where it rains a lot, we still as well have to start to think now about times of water scarcity and times of water shortages. We had, for example, last summer in June, July 2018, some really significant water shortages in some parts of the country. So we had a regulatory initiative that said, as domestic householders, we're going to get water meters, where we have an economic incentive that we use less water in the home in order to save on water, reduce these water shortages. And people have been responding to that. That's good. And what we are seeing is that during the normal courses, when there's still enough water supply, these meters help to bring down water consumption. But then in an actual water scarcity episode, in an actual drought, we see that people already have done all that they can to reduce their water consumption, and there's nothing further behaviorally that they really can do in order to properly respond to the drought and even further lower consumption. So there it is, a well-intentioned regulatory initiative, but with some unintended consequences as well that hadn't been really thought about there before. And also kind of we have, I think, an interesting social-legal puzzle here in the sense that we have, despite significant scientific knowledges, still really indeterminate legal rules. So the promise of scientific knowledge often as well is to help to narrow down and specify broad discretionary provisions in legal rules, and hence to help to steer a legal decision maker, such as, for example, in a regulatory agency, to a particular decision and maybe to the right decision. So to have a way to really steer to a particular decision. But we don't, I think, see that still quite happening. And we know, of course, as well, from more fundamental debates among critical legal scholars, that there's sort of entrenched indeterminacy, incoherence, and contradictions often in legal rules. So we see there as well, really more fundamentally, the point being argued that it's very difficult to provide the determinate legal rule for professionals working in public administration, and getting towards really clear criteria for narrowing down discretionary powers. And also, I think we see still ambivalent attitudes of legal decision makers to scientific knowledges. I think it's by no means a matter that we find public administrators just jumping at the opportunity to get input, say, from scientific expertise and using that in order to be steered towards particular decisions, and to think that really there's the possibility for scientific knowledge to enhance rationality in legal decision making. And in fact we see as well some resistance, I think, to the use of scientific knowledges and evidence, as well from the perspective that this might lead to a very technocratic approach towards making legal decisions that is potentially at odds with a more democratic way of thinking of how to make legal decisions. So these three puzzles that I think arise from uncertainty about the link between law and science are not new. I think they're quite fundamental and enduring, but I think they have really increased salience and contemporary context where we find really governance challenges that are characterized as deeply uncertain, and that therefore normally would renew calls for trying to find evidence and scientific knowledges that help to make the legal decisions. And so by deep uncertainty, really, we refer to structural and fundamental limits to the scientific knowledge available for developing law or taking regulatory decisions. And various terms have been coined by policymakers and regulators to capture such deep uncertainty. For instance, in the context of the subprime mortgage crisis in the USA in 2008, the former chairman of the US Federal Reserve Bank, Alan Greenspan, up there kind of in the picture as well, he talked about unknown unknowns in order to characterize the unforeseen consequences for the entire global banking system that unfolded from the selling of mortgages to homeowners who could not afford the loans and the subsequent securitization and selling on of debts. And another term that has been coined in order to capture this deep uncertainty is the notion of the black swan event, which refers to the occurrence of high impact but low probability events, which can come as a surprise. And of course, examples of severe weather events, such as droughts and floods, that are difficult to predict, but can have very severe impacts and therefore cannot be ignored when developing regulatory strategies, are important examples of that. So a change in climate, for example, is an area for regulation and governance as well, where we can clearly see the manifestation of, I think, these empirical research puzzles around the law-science relationship. And if we start to look at that and start off and see the Paris Agreement, for example, we could think, well, in the first instance, it looks like we're having here a good way of sort of harnessing effectively scientific knowledges. There's an incredible machinery around the production of, for example, the panels from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that has fed into the deliberations that are very important and that have led some way down the road to set precise, scientifically informed legal standards, such as the commitment of the signatory states to the Paris Climate Agreement to keep levels of global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius with a specific target of 1.5. And so while at first glance this looks like a determinate legal rule informed by scientific knowledge, it is deeply uncertain what behavioral consequence this should really have. And it's by no means clear what mix of policy and legal instruments signatory states may have to implement to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius with reference to pre-industrial temperature levels. And one might think, well, it's not an entirely startling point, but if we start to look at as well how in some jurisdictions courts approach the issues about what policy mix and what regulation initiatives to embrace to tackle the issue of the deeply uncertain issue as well of climate change, I think we just get a sense about how concerning this is, the sort of field of indeterminacy that opens up, despite the fact that at the beginning it starts to look like they have quite precise temperature references, quite specific commitments in one way. And I just want to briefly refer here to the example of Australia. So Australia, clearly a very significant greenhouse gas emitter. It has actually one of the highest per capita emissions of carbon dioxide in the world. With 0.3% of the world's population, it produces 1.3% of the world's greenhouse gases. And what we've seen there, some really interesting examples of judicial reasoning and some interesting climate change litigation cases. And I've put up there on the slide an example of a recent case, which is the Coast and Country Association of Queensland, whose interest as a nature conservation association was taken up by the Environmental Defenders Office of the state of Queensland. And they started litigation, a public law action, against the authorization of a huge open-cast coal mine in the state of Queensland, the picture up there to see, run by a company called Hancock the Alpha Mine. huge vast field for digging out the coal out of the ground. And that Conservation Association brought a claim and saying that there shouldn't be the permits issued in order to lawfully let this mine to open and start to go ahead. And so what we saw in that case is a claim from the Coast and Country Association of Queensland to say that the Scope 3 emissions from this mine, these are the emissions that arise once the coal is out of the ground and is being transported and is being burned in a power station somewhere else, that the emissions from the transport and from the burning in a power station somewhere else should be taken into account when considering the environmental impact of this mine and when making the decision whether the environmental impact is so strong that it shouldn't be getting an environmental permit and a permit under mineral resources legislation. And the court rejected the idea that the Scope 3 emissions should be considered, and on appeal that was affirmed. So this case is the appeal from the Land Court of the State of Queensland, and the judges said, well, the Scope 3 emissions should not be considered because the factual situation is that even if this mine would not be authorized, another mine would somewhere go ahead, and therefore overall emissions wouldn't be reduced even if we don't give a permit to this particular mine. So what they said is that it's the capacity of the power stations that burn the coal, for example in China, to generate electricity, rather than the availability of the coal, which determines the amount of coal which would be burned in the power stations. And accordingly, the judges accepted the argument made on behalf of the applicants, Hancock, for the mining project, that global greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation and burning of the coal would not fall within the scope of emissions to be considered for the particular mine that was planned, and hence for the Alpha mine. And they took it hence as accepted evidence that emissions from the transportation and burning of the coal had any consequential effect upon the climate would not be increased simply due to the particular mine being authorized generating coal. So we have, on the one hand, these discourses of uncertainty, even where we have attempts, with international climate agreements as well, to get uncertainty in the legal rules that we have. And they matter if we think as well in the light of that reasoning of judges. But I think as well we live in times where in our societies we see some quite so fundamental movements towards discourses of certainty. And in particular we've seen populist political movements in contemporary societies that really seek to affirm certainty in social ordering. And we see these movements in Germany, we see these movements in the United Kingdom, and in the United Kingdom as well there's some very salient examples in the context of the current debates around the relationship of the United Kingdom to the European Union. And so I think these are not interesting, just more generally countervailing forces to the discourses of uncertainty in law and society, but I think they do also have some more specific consequences for the mobilization of scientific knowledge, for developing public policies and taking regulatory decisions, for really the specifics of that. And so these discourses of certainty seek to affirm certainty in our contemporary lives, which are otherwise characterized by a rapidly changing and globalizing world. They're characterized by the fact that plurality in political opinions and policies is suppressed in favor of strong political leadership that is autocratic and does not encourage open debate and dissent, but instead favors certainty and social ordering. And the identification of political opponents has now become easy. They are the elites who are removed from the everyday realities of economic struggle of marginalized sections of the population. And hence we witness, I think, an interesting paradox between two perspectives that are central to the contemporary ordering of societies. On the one hand, there's a recognition of the increasing complexity of contemporary lives, with the consequence that we seek to mobilize sciences in order to govern societies. For instance, when we develop and implement state law, particularly in the case of deeply uncertain governance challenges. And on the other hand, there are attempts to reassert hierarchies and appeal to traditional social values, which are accompanied by a simplification of the pictures of the social and natural world painted, in particular through populist political movements. So So one aspect of the political discourses of populism is skepticism about experts and scientific knowledges. And as a former UK Education Secretary, and now, and at this time as well heading the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, now the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Gove, said during the Brexit campaign, and I quote, "We've had enough of experts." And so this seems particularly troubling when this shades into skepticism about the Enlightenment project itself, which envisages citizens to reason through rather than delegate decisions about uncertainties that beset our lives or simply react upon impulse. And so in light of these countervailing discourses of uncertainty and certainty in the governance of contemporary societies, it has thus become, I think, particularly urgent again to understand what opportunities and limitations there are for informing legal governance by scientific knowledges. So, to come on to the actual literature review that we conducted of key contributions to the relationship between law and science debates in academic and practitioner-oriented literature. Just to start with clarifying terms at the beginning, in terms of science, I want to refer to Robert Merton's idea of science being distinguished by the fact of the use of specific methods that are governed also by cultural norms and which lead to the generation of a distinct body of knowledge. So this captures as well examples such as environmental science and economic knowledges, examples of these being environmental impact assessments, various types of modeling, for example of air and water quality, as well as financial estimates of services provided, for example, by ecosystems for humans. And also we'll use in subsequent parts of the talk the term evidence to refer to a narrower segment of scientific knowledge practices. And it captures those scientific knowledge practices that organizations have come to consider as relevant for developing public policies and taking regulatory decisions. Often the term evidence thus refers to applied research, which has moved from the organizations in which it has originally been generated to the epistemic professional communities of policymakers and regulators. And by public policymaking, I refer to the development of programs of action guided by particular procedures that seek to tackle a range of regulatory issues. And this definition can also accommodate merely rhetorical reference to rational deliberation informing the making of public policy as a means for policymakers to enhance their own legitimacy and manage accountability claims they may be subject to. And I define regulatory decision-taking as occurring within and sometimes steered by the broader context of policymaking. It is concerned with setting standards and enforcing them. Often, but not necessarily, regulatory decisions are taken by public regulatory agencies or regulated organizations themselves in response to powers and duties granted by primary or secondary legislation seeking to manage a range of economic, environmental and social risks. So when we started off in defining the scope for our literature review, we thought, well, what would be the really interesting question to ask here? And clearly one of the questions we could think of, well, what role does evidence play in distinct policy making and regulatory decision making? We thought we wanted to tweak that, depart from that and ask instead, well, to turn it around, what becomes really considered as evidence by decision makers? And how is actually the production, the perception and use of this evidence shaped by relevant organizational processes? So we're steering towards sort of consideration of the idea of evidence as an organizational process, where we're saying we're interested in exploring whether evidence can be considered not just as a static knowledge claim by an individual author of that particular knowledge claim, fixed, for example, in a report, such as the reports as well, multi-authored, though of course as well from the climate change panels, but that we wanted to think about evidence production and developing policy taking and taking of regulatory decisions as closely linked and not as two entirely distinct phenomena, to create a closer link between the organizational processes of generating the knowledge and the knowledge product at the end. So this was our starting point in terms of formulating the research question that guided the examination of a range of literature. And so our interest was to summarize really findings in terms of thinking, well, overall, kind of what can we really learn from this literature about typologies of evidence use and public policy making that has some relevance, I think, as well, of course, for regulatory decision making and is more overarching. So we found as well categorization of types of evidence provider. Not many typologies there, but typologies that distinguish individual evidence providers according to their degree of politicization, the degree to which they're drawn into the more political aspects of the making of the public policy, and the degree to which they have some awareness as well themselves as evidence providers and being drawn into that. We also found typologies around different types of evidence that is being produced, being solicited, in the sense of political knowledge itself, a knowledge of the policy-making process being part of what is generated. Then a more traditional notion of scientific knowledge, i.e. of knowledge that follows the standards and procedures and of what is considered as legitimate knowledge claims from an academic perspective, but also types of evidence that focus more on practical and professional experience, on over years of professional activity conducted, understandings and the knowledge that comes from that. There's also a whole interesting range of ways to summarize the different drivers and obstacles to the influence of evidence on policies, various different ways, again, of putting that into a typology. And so what we found is that at times the disciplinary background and the experience of the actors involved in their relationships with one another, including their organization into epistemic communities, played a role in terms of the ability to translate from a particular scientific community, say, to a policymakers community, to how close that gap could be bridged, to how easy it would be to engage into that translation process. We found as well the idea that the nature of the evidence itself can have a bearing on to how easily it can be communicated across, for example, from scientists to policymakers. The nature of the policy issue at stake having a bearing on that, as well particular organizational structures and processes. Whether, for example, already a civil service department, for example, has in-house researchers or has to bridge as well a wider gap in communicating with researchers externally and so forth. And then, of course, as well, it's possible to categorize different literature in terms of the ways in which evidence influences policy. And quite often there's reference to the distinction between an instrumental use of evidence, where evidence is meant to directly inform decisions of the policymaker or regulatory decision taker, then the idea of a conceptual influence, where the idea is, well, the evidence is really sort of forming the frame in which, say, the civil servant or the regulator is starting to take decisions. So it's a more background informing the framing of the issue at stake to be decided, but also, of course, symbolic use of evidence, where really the issue is that the decision maker may already politically have committed him or herself to a particular outcome of the decision and is seeking to use evidence in order at the end as well further justify and to defend the decision. And the whole process of gathering the evidence is really more symbolic. So in the grey literature then we can see some interesting distinctions in terms of what here the understanding is on how scientific knowledges and evidence can become relevant. And here we see much more emphasis really on what functions the evidence can provide, and in a more practical sense as well, how it can become useful for the particular issue, for decision at stake, for the particular decision maker. And I've referred there kind of on the slide as well to a foundational document from the UK Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. It's evidence strategy that says, well, we're particularly interested in terms of functions that the evidence for us should fulfill in system thinking, but really thereby crossing disciplinary boundaries. That particularly in terms of environmental regulation, we want to make sure that we can bridge as well kind of the more natural science, scientific understanding, say, of flooding events, with also kind of what the social scientists would tell us about that, so that we can think about the governance challenge in a more integrated and, in that way, systemic way. There's also interest there kind of in what evidence can deliver in people and place-based thinking, and a particular interest in saying that natural scales can be quite important for informing the evidence that becomes relevant, so that we should have a sense of what political communities in particular locations understand as the particular governance challenge, and that we shouldn't be just having an abstract academic take kind of on what the scientific evidence here is. There's also an interest in saying what the evidence should provide is really an analysis of risk and opportunity. So here the evidence becomes focused on horizon scanning, that we can sort of look ahead and use the evidence for knowing kind of what's the next challenge that might be coming, not just what is the existing sort of governance challenge. So having evidence that is particularly capable of being forward-looking and predicting as well future scenarios. Then there's particular interest in effective use of existing data and existing research. The idea of saying, well, we're interested particularly as well in meta-studies that can compile what's known out there in the literature already, and that we want to build on that and want to have that harnessed for informing our public policy making and the taking of regulatory decisions. And something in the next point that the department is particularly interested as well in further strengthening is effective evaluation of policies, to say, well, what we really need for evidence, and something that we want to put more emphasis on in the future, is to have evaluation studies that show us, once we've got a regulatory initiative in place, on really what were its effects and how can we further use that knowledge about actual implementation to inform reform for the future. And finally, kind of the DEFRA evidence strategy document refers to modeling as very important, including a notion of operational assistance research and decision support, to say that here more academic-based research outputs such as models should be tied to the purpose of providing support for government decision-making, and particularly economic models that can enhance value for money delivered by governmental policies are something that DEFRA, is particularly the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the United Kingdom, is particularly interested in. So I think what this overview of here as well from the grey literature is showing us that the sources of evidence that become considered as legitimate and that policymakers and regulators are interested in are pluralizing. We are seeing something much wider than beyond the traditional boundaries of academic knowledge claims that become of interest here for the work of public policymakers and regulators. And there's no automatic priority for academic knowledge practices when it comes to the nature and use of evidence and the context of public policy making and the taking of regulatory decisions. So in the literature review as well, and in the further in the written paper for this, we as well explore further factors that hinder influence of evidence on public policy making. I don't have time really kind of in the presentation today here to go into that, so I want to come on to really the next point, which is that we are suggesting that we should think then of evidence as an organizational process constructed in closely knit networks between evidence providers and the organizational users of that evidence. We capture that through the notion of the distributed production of evidence. And so evidence here does not emerge as a specific identifiable piece that can be linked back to necessarily an individual author, but it can actually be a shared organizational commodity. And so various individual and organizational actors with different roles are involved in the evidence production, and we see further manifestations of this. So for example, a particular program for generating evidence may be jointly funded by multiple actors, So we saw a number of examples where it isn't just traceable to one particular organization that is funding that particular piece of evidence, but we're seeing multi-actor consortia, that is, groups and organizational networks become involved in the funding of the evidence. And also that a single piece of evidence really travels down the decision-making process where it may be used to one piece of evidence to inform multiple decisions. So as well in that sense, we see a way on how a piece of evidence becomes really part of a more of a notion of distributed production of evidence. So here it is different factors promoting, that I briefly mentioned before, distributed evidence production. So we see that, for example, rules for commissioning the evidence, procurement practice, and template contracts can promote this idea of organizational networks being established, where the rules from a civil service government department further influence then really kind of what evidence becomes available, rather than this being done more autonomously by, say, just an academic research institute by itself. We also see, I think, and I want to focus on this point here, the idea of distributed evidence production promoted through the rise of knowledge brokers. This is a very interesting, more recent phenomenon in the context of evidence production, where we see that knowledge brokers promote the idea of distributed evidence production because they really increase as well an indicator of the breadth and complexity of the distributed production of evidence. So knowledge brokers are actors who link producers and users of evidence. Typically, the term is used more specifically to refer to individual or organizational actors who link academic researchers and policymakers. And so knowledge brokers are thus not just an additional organizational actor, but through their various activities, they create links between different organizations involved in the production of evidence. And they thereby further stabilize the distributed production of evidence. And this really occurs through three types of knowledge broker activity. The first concerns knowledge management, which entails knowledge brokers accessing, sharing, and translating knowledge for decision makers. The second type of activity involves linkage and exchange, which includes knowledge brokers building relationships between researchers and decision makers. And the third type involves knowledge brokers engaging in capacity building by enhancing the ability of decision makers to access and use research, for instance by explaining methodological limitations of evidence production. And capacity building can also entail researchers to communicate their work to non-specialist, non-technical audiences of generalists, government, civil servants, or regulators. And interest-based evidence production is a really interesting factor as well, very briefly to mention here, that promotes further the distributed evidence production. And what we see here is that here in the distributed production of evidence, there's involvement of organizations and individuals affected by public policies and regulatory decisions. For instance, Abraham and Lange discussed the validation and the use of new toxicology tests for certain pharmaceutical products, which were heavily influenced by industry. And in this case, regulated organizations and individuals are not simply one contributor to the distributed production of evidence, but may exert a dominant influence in organizational networks of evidence production. So I'd like to move on to discuss some of these ideas about the law-science relationship, and particular ideas about attempts to use evidence in instrumental ways or as framing in conceptual ways, as framing the backdrop against which civil servants or regulators use evidence in the context of managing water resources in the United Kingdom. And so what we see is, as well in the United Kingdom, increasingly in the context of a changing climate, specific challenges for managing water resources, and in particular alternating events such as of severe weather events associated with flooding and water scarcity, for example. And so I mentioned at the beginning already as well that we had last summer a particular period of water scarcity in the United Kingdom. But even further historically, up to 1976, we can see times of significant water scarcity in 1976, 1995, 2003-06. So over some time now building up really the challenge of dealing as well with water scarcity. And we have there interesting legal provisions on the statute book that tell us in concrete terms what powers are available for here a government minister to handle water shortages. And I think what we see from this particular provision of looking at a particular part from the Water Resources Act 1991 here, we see an attempt to use evidence in an instrumental way. So here we see a piece of legislation, I hope that is sort of fairly readable, that says there's a power to apply for drought orders. So this is a particular power for the Secretary of State, for the Minister, to use an order under which, for example, some obstructors, an industrial obstructor, for example, can be limited in what they're obstructing as water from the natural environment in order to enhance the amount of water that is available, say, for a water company to obstruct and to put into the public water supply, so to make sure that there's sufficient drinking water for the population, even in a time of water scarcity. So there is a particular legal provision on the statute book that gives that power for the so-called drought order. And it says, under section 73, there is a power to make ordinary or emergency drought orders if the Secretary of State is satisfied that by reason of an exceptional shortage of rain, there exists or is threatened a serious deficiency of supplies of water in any area, or such a deficiency in the flow or level of water in any inland waters as to pose a serious threat to any of the flora or fauna which are dependent on those waters, then subject to the following provisions of this chapter in the statute, he may by order, and this chapter referred to as an ordinary drought order, make such provision authorized by this chapter as appears to him to be expedient with the view of meeting the deficiency. And so we see the attempt to use here scientific expertise, for example from hydrological modeling, from data about rainfall statistics, to say, well, do we actually have a serious deficiency of water? Because that has to be shown in order to use that legal power. And yes, the idea is to say scientific evidence should help us here for the Secretary of State to know whether he can enact the power or not, whether he can use that power or not. And so the tricky part, of course, as well, is that the Secretary of State would have to make a decision whether there's really a serious deficiency in the water available due to the lack of the rainfall, or whether there may be perhaps human factors that are the actual reason for the deficiency in the water. And this could be just a simple mismanagement of the water resources, rather than anything that is just about the natural environment out there, about the change in the rainfall pattern. And in the United Kingdom, this is very much about leakage from pipes. There's an old Victorian supply system, and significant leakage means that it's really lack of investment in the infrastructure that is more of the reason for the water shortage than really what's changing in the rainfall. So we can see that the provision, how it's phrased in the law, is steering as well to make a distinction between the more social factors influencing the deficiency in the supply, or whether it's the natural factors. And so initially intended, it was meant to be here a helpful instrumental use of science. That is actually less straightforward than I think the initial draft of the provision had in mind this could be. So we see again here a practical example of the limits of using science in an instrumental way. Then we see, I think as well, a bit of practical illustration of the idea how science helps conceptually to frame, and making a distinction here between the social factors and the natural science conditions. But then we can also see that this demarcation between the natural and social factors is no longer really an appropriate one. I think implicitly this provision from 1991 steers towards that. But now, I think in the Anthropocene, we are in a context where that clear demarcation doesn't work so much, because, for example, our choices about transport policies we think have some bearing on weather patterns, and at the end have some idea how strong the rainfall really is and what rainfall patterns are. So we have evidence as well kind of becoming involved here in conceptual framing. One of the things we know from the academic literature what evidence can do, but it does so in a really problematic way and in a potentially misleading way, and make this demarcation between the social science factors for invoking the legal power and the natural science basis that has to be demonstrated. So just to sort of further give some practical illustrations from the empirical project on how water resources are actually managed currently in practice in the United Kingdom that we're working on. I want to give some further examples of this idea then, what it means to say evidence is an organizational process. So what we're finding there as well is that we have some quite strategic and selective views of environmental evidence. So we have, under Article 3 of an EU directive on environmental impact assessment, potentially a legal obligation that water companies in the United Kingdom should carry out environmental impact assessments of drought plans that they're meant to draft. These are sort of written out plans that in strategic terms should set out that during an actual water shortage, what type of measures really will the water company take in order to manage the resource shortage, what initiatives it will encourage citizens to take, which obstructors it may want to limit, how much water they can take in order to have enough for the public water supply and so forth. And what we found from the interviews as well is that 7 out of the 21 water companies said that they actually didn't carry out strategic environmental assessments for their drought plans. They would only carry them out for a broader planning tool called a water resource management plan. And hence we see a limited instrumental use, really the opportunity to use the environmental science that comes from an environmental impact assessment being mobilized to look at the impacts that ways of dealing with a shortage of water can have an impact as well, by ensuring that there's enough water in the public water supply, for example, lowering rivers levels in the rivers and affecting fauna and flora. So we're seeing sort of limited uptake of the opportunity there of the environmental science to limited instrumental use, and also in terms of how that is connected to evidence being part of organizational processes, that we heard that resource managers were saying, well, it's the water resource management plans that are signed off by the board. These drought plans, they're a lot less important. They don't make it up all the way to the board. So we're not doing the full environmental impact assessment there. And hence part of organizational culture and parts of organization has a bearing kind of on the limited instrumental use of potential environmental science. We also found, interestingly, at times, no evidence, and that's sort of against the background that there is a plethora on some aspects where there is lots of different types of environmental science knowledge being mobilized in water resource management. And here's an extract of a table that we have in the full-length version of the paper where we refer to all the different types of environmental science evidence that can be used in managing water resources. And so on the one hand it looks there's a whole broad range of things that are available there, but then we've got on some very specific pinpointed bits that are important for managing water resources, no evidence. So we have sort of range of things that are being used on evidence and then some really specific peculiar gaps. And the first one there relates really to hydroecology, in the sense that there isn't really all that much knowledge about the impact, for example, of water shortages on the ecologies of rivers, and particular recovery rates of flora and fauna. There's a way of thinking about water shortages as well that would suggest that they don't necessarily are that disastrous. There's certain recovery possibilities as well, but it's important to know under what conditions that is really possible, and so the data on that is actually sort of quite limited. And also we heard from the interviews that the other evidence gap is really that there's limited knowledge about customer behavior in relation to water use. So the gathering of a more social science evidence base around as well what customers consider as fair distribution of water, particularly in water shortage situations, is quite limited. So one of the findings is that no evidence on very specific pinpointed aspects of of an evidence base. And finally, kind of what we find as well is that under the heading of many and new types of cooks, that there's generated evidence production in a distributed manner in organizational networks, and we see that in practical, empirical detail in the context where we looked at it, and that we saw a very significant role for consultants in water resource management, and we saw them as one of the actors who are part of the creation of these really organizational networks, rather than sort of binary relationships just between a regulator and a regulated organization and how they want to use evidence, but that it's really in a broader organizational network where these consultants play an important role. They're often engaged in drafting, for example, drought plans or these water resource management plans. They're therefore becoming important in diffusing particular interpretations of legal rules. So their role is quite significant in that way as well. And we also see, as a very recent development, very interestingly, in water resource management in the United Kingdom, a new type of intermediary, a new type of cook in these organizational networks. And these are third-party intermediaries who advise large organizations who get water services in switching to new water retail service providers. So we have increasingly in the United Kingdom as well policies that seek to introduce markets in the management of water resources, and as well in those among companies to see opening up of markets among companies who provide retail services like billing for water companies, and hence intermediaries and how the water company interacts with their final customers. And so there are parties now who are advising water companies who are receiving water services about which water companies they should contract with to get the best service. And that obviously sort of touches upon a whole range of criteria that could become relevant to say whether I get my water as an organization from water company X or Y, and hence these could be issues around green credentials. These could be about water company A can give you a water efficiency audit that you might very useful as an organization receiving water services. But it also will be around issues of quality of service more generally, and around economic considerations of cost of the service and so forth. And hence we are seeing there really then as well a further blurring of boundaries around the theme of science and politics, and the notion of politicized really evidence being provided in terms of consultants of these third-party intermediaries becoming involved in giving advice for companies seeking to switch between different providers and water services. So to conclude, the sort of key points that I wanted to draw out so far is to say that what we see is really the development of wider populist political discourses which question very fundamentally ideas of expertise in various areas of public life. And I think they give a new impetus for research agendas about the law-science nexus. And I think we see actually variation in and a pluralizing of conceptions of evidence and action and public policy making and the taking of regulatory decisions. We see something much broader beyond the traditional model of academic science becoming of interest to public policymakers and regulators, including citizen science, including using social media to generate social science evidence, and hence a pluralizing of sources of legitimate knowledge claims. And I wanted to emphasize in this argument that I think we should think about evidence production as an organizational process. And that means that there's really distributed production of evidence and networks of organizational and individual actors. And I think that leads us to a less clear-cut demarcation between the knowledge claims themselves and the organizations that use them. And I think we're seeing much more fluid interplay between the generators of the knowledge claims, the organizations that use them, how they try to steer that at times as well, and the empirical research findings that I've briefly drawn attention to that were further illustrating that in the context of managing water resources in the UK is that we see limited strategic use of evidence, we see no evidence, and we see a range of knowledge brokers becoming involved in the production in these organizational networks of the knowledge. And I think we have limited boundary conflicts between science, politics, but potentially a greater politicization of knowledge production. And just very finally, since this is the session kind of in the seminar series on Luhmannian systems theoretical ideas, even though there is empirical research that I talked about is not designed to apply Luhmannian ideas, and in the literature review we looked at a range of different contributions, thinking about law and science, interconnections, I thought it would be interesting at the end as well to draw out some key themes and questions maybe we could think of when linking back specifically to Luhmannian ideas again. And it seems to me what really our research is drifting to, what it's sort of generally, the general trajectory that it is pointing to is that we see significant openness between different social subsystems of law, science, economics and politics. And I think there's limited boundary drawing between these different systems. Organizational networks can bridge these, in Luhmannian terms, functionally differentiated social subsystems, and we can perhaps think about some of the examples of what the knowledge brokers are doing, what the consultants are doing. Perhaps we can think about them in Luhmannian terms as forms of structural coupling, or the Luhmannian idea of specific mediator organizations, with organizations being a distinct social subsystem. So I think what we also see then is a need to rethink truth and non-truth as binary coding for the social subsystem of science, applied science, that is part as well of that pluralizing evidence space. I think that policymakers and regulators are prepared to use. They work rather with the code of relevance and non-relevance of the science to the policymakers. There's really a strong dimension of understanding significance through the lens of the particular organizational mandates, political agendas, and sometimes legal mandates. And finally, and perhaps most fundamentally, a really sort of important and interesting and developing strand in the literature on environmental regulation is, of course, engagement with the idea of the Anthropocene. The idea, what we are currently doing as human actors, is such fundamental interference in Earth systems that we are becoming part of how natural Earth systems really work. And perhaps that is one of the most fundamental ways to question Luhmannian ideas, particularly when we think about the interface between natural subsystems and social subsystems, to question very fundamentally to what extent they are highly functionally differentiate, or to what extent we are seeing quite strong forms of structural coupling. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bettina, for a thought-provoking lecture. And tá passando a lista? So I will give the word to Professor Laurindo.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to, first of all, thank the organizers of this event for the kind invitation to taking part in it. Especially, I'd like to thank Lucas Amato, Marco Barros, and Professor Celso Campilongo. I'm very glad to meet Professor Bettina Lange. Well, this seems to be a timely academic event. Because it expresses an effort to bring together system theory and empirical research, and this has been really itself a very difficult task. In this presentation, I will briefly indicate some of the main dimensions of an argument that I have been trying to develop in recent works regarding specifically the meaning and the possibility of a critical reading of Luhmannian system theory. Then I will try to mobilize some of these dimensions in the direction of a preliminary systemic critique of academic capitalism. This notion appeared in the beginning of the 90s and has been since used by an expanding body of literature about the changing organization and semantic settings of the university. In the first part, I will concentrate on two aspects: the presence of some normative motives in Luhmannian conceptual formations, and the presence of some elective affinities between Luhmann's and Theodor Adorno's theoretical designs. In the second part, I will try to characterize some elements of neoliberal rationality as a distinct trait in the configuration of contemporary capitalist society, and to present academic capitalism as a project for the reorganization of the universe along the lines of this rationality. At the end, I will make some preliminary methodological observations regarding the importance of empirical research for a systemic critique of academic capitalism. So, let's begin with the attempt to identify some crypto-normative elements in Luhmannian systems theory, notably those with a high potential of stabilizing counterfactual expectations in regard to current empirical social trends. To name just a few of them: the emphasis on polycontextuality, as is well known, by overcoming the primacy of historical patterns of segmentary, geographic, and stratified differentiation, which, however, evidently do not simply disappear. Modern functionally differentiated society presents itself as a social arrangement that has no center or vertex. In this way, different partial systems would form a mosaic of distinct rationalities in a polycontextual social world. What is to be stressed here is the radical theoretical investment in the possibility of a plurality of processes for the production of meaning in society. Next, the emphasis on a non-totalizing relationship between the individual and society. In a society marked by the premise of functional differentiation, the distinct operations that reconstruct the individual inside each partial system, as a consumer, voter, patient, student, etc., certainly do not do justice to the complex of the individual as a concrete being. However, these abstractions offer the individual something like the possibility of navigating a contingent and diversified social environment. On the one hand, it is not able to fully reduce the individual to the social whole. And secondly, it's not capable of unilaterally generalizing and imposing on the individual a single criterion of reduction of others. Next, the emphasis on the universal access of individuals to the performance of different partial systems, mainly in the context of the welfare state arrangements and policies, and the corresponding claim that criteria for exclusions have been redirected from hierarchical to functional premise in the transition to modern society. To quote an exemplary passage, the having not code becomes autonomous insofar as it means nothing to the extra-economical functional context, namely, that it does not transfer property inequalities to other subsystems of society, so that masses are not celebrated more often for the owners than for no owners, as well as better chances of education, better procedural chances in the legal system, better chances of being elected to political office, better chances of treatment in case of illness, etc., etc. And last, but not definitely least, the emphasis on the concept of system as a form, that is, as a difference between system and environment. The unit between system and environment is not conceived along the traditional dialectical lines as the unit of identity and no-identity. Rather, as is well known, it is conceived as the no-identity of identity and no-identity. If I'm not mistaken here, this opens up very possibilities for a critical reading of systems theory. Let me elaborate a little bit on this. For different strands of critical theory, a system is mainly regarded as a domination device that allows for the blind reproduction of society at the subject's back. A system operates on the basis of real abstractions that inflict violence against both the object and the subject, internal and external nature. According to a Hegelian formulation, a system deals with mere classificatory external difference that does not differentiate enough. A system without a distinction, without a difference. This way of conceiving systems applies especially to the capitalist systems and the commodity fetishism that it engenders, running from Marx through Adorno until Habermas' communicative theory of society. For this tradition, systems autonomy means solipsism and tautology, and the relationship between systems is framed as one of colonization. With Adorno, we could say that a system is a difference-devouring machine. The point here is that Luhmann reconceives system in a radically distant direction. To begin with, as a form, the system is not conceived as the difference between identity and identity, but as a social system, it constitutes itself from difference that make a difference. Peterson's concept of information. A system is not only closed in the recursive circuit of its internal operations, but it is also cognitively open to its environment. More precisely, it is capable of opening because it is closed. Here there is no external determination. Nothing comes directly from the environment into the system. There is no exact correspondence between system and environment. The environment, by definition, is always more complex than the systems. On the one hand, there is always a supplement that the system cannot totalize. On the other, there is always an internal work of coding, filtering, or translation. Thus conceived, the system form is a form for both autonomy and interdependency. In other words, there is no solipsism, there is no colonization. For the sake of brevity, one could say that these normative motives are not conceived here as social fait accompli, rather as in ideal typical formations, they seem to point to some social historical tendencies and objective possibilities that does not fully realize themselves in unproblematic ways. From this perspective, empirical limits confronting the theoretical constellation could be illuminated from within the constellation itself, provided it's used in a negative way. That is, as I said elsewhere, as an analytical device for mapping counter-tendencies of de-differentiation, tautology, and colonization. The second dimension of the argument regards an attempt of articulating some aspects of Luhmann's system theory and some aspects of Adorno's very peculiar strand of critical theory. This is done with the double aim of indicating some elective affinities between these very different theoretical constellations and of substantiating a critical reading of Luhmann's theory. From Adorno, what interests us most here is both a specific way of conceiving the relationship between different social spheres and his project of negative dialectics and the critique of identity thinking. Although both aspects are clearly articulated, they can be analytically decomposed for the sake of exposition. Regarding the relationship between different social spheres, I take as a starting point the observations of a commentator of Adorno. The more society becomes one-dimensional, the more critique must pay attention to the internal structure and the relatively autonomous logic of cultural objects. In a sense, Adorno's social analysis could be conceived as a theoretical effort to articulate this paradoxical claim and the tensions implied in it. This tension seems to have to do with the contradictory character of social development in modernity, which points at the same time towards differentiation and unidimensionality. From this point of view, modern tendencies towards autonomy and heteronomy, differentiation and unidimensionality could be analytically grasped within different social spheres. These social spheres could be conceived as force fields or conflictual formations. In this sense, elaborating a critique of society means, first, taking seriously the autonomy claims advanced by society's partial spheres, and at the same time the obstacles that capitalism interposes in the realization of these claims. And this can only be done through an inflection towards the internal workings of the particular character of these spheres. It almost goes without saying that this goes well beyond the so-called economic reflection studies. To reinforce this point, let's briefly take some aspects of the Adornian critique of art. To refer to a well-known Adornian formula, the work of art is both autonomous and socially mediated. As an expression of this double nature, the aesthetic articulation of dimensions of the social process constitutes a manifestation of art's freedom. Art frames from within, in an independent way, the social process. According to its self-concept, art is a form that can elaborate other social forms in an internal way. The problem lies precisely in the direction of the historical process. In late capitalism, the sphere of art presents a bifurcated movement, finding itself under a double attack, so to speak. On the one hand, commodification, which establishes economic procedures that instrumentalize the aesthetic, and in the case of the cultural industry, as in the case of the cultural industry. On the other, hyperformalization, which can be seen as a kind of internal reaction to the tendency of colonization and points to the increasing loss of articulation between aesthetic form and lived experience. On the one hand, external, unmediated determination implies loss of autonomy. On the other, as a reaction to this, the internal formalist affirmation of art's autonomy leads to a loss of social relevance. The social critique of the art sphere proposed by Adorno corresponds to the mapping of this deterioration of aesthetic meaning and the emptying out of the subject's experience that is related to it. In this sense, perhaps one could say that this kind of critique takes into account the increasing discrepancy between art's self-descriptions and social tendencies towards both solipsism and colonization. Even if the autonomous and socially mediated artwork becomes increasingly improbable under late capitalism, it is still retained as a possibility and offers guidance for analysis and critique. Regarding the project of negative dialectics, the first thing to note is that Adorno refers to this project as a sort of utopia. More precisely, a cognitive utopia would be to use concepts to unseal the non-conceptual with concepts, without making it their equal. The recognition of the insufficiency of the identificatory procedure, always present in the process of building concepts, is the first distinctive feature of the Adorno project of negative dialects. I quote, "The name of dialect says no more, to begin with, than that objects do not go into their concepts without leaving a reminder, that they come to contradict the traditional norm of adequacy." In negative dialectics, the operations of meaning fixation, proper to conceptual identification, maintain a relation of no identity with a horizon of meaning possibilities that always remain latent, since it is not exhausted by these operations. In this sense, negative dialect is precisely the reverse of the commodities logic and the violent identification to operating things, by disregarding its particular character. If I were allowed to think with Luhmann to clarify Adorno on this point, perhaps it could be said that these operations are conceived, as it were, as conscious operations of reduction of complexity that always remain contingent. Likewise, perhaps we could also read Luhmann from this Adornian perspective and note that, in the way it is conceived by Luhmann, the simultaneous constitution of system and environment is a kind of negative dialects in act. A real abstraction, elaborated by society, incorporates its other, the environment, by the recognition of its no correspondence and no identity. In relation to the environment, taking as a repertoire of unstructured possibilities for actualizing meaning, the system operates consciously a reduction. In this way, system seems to constitute a socially mediated autonomy, in which internal procedures filter, translate, and internally recreate external events. It should also be noted that these reductions are contingent, always leaving room for other possibilities of selection. It is in this sense that a certain elective affinity in the proper sense could be identified between negative dialects of subject and object and the reciprocal constitutions between system and environment. After all, both are about openness without loss of identity, without any direct determination, and without totalization. Moving to the second part, one should note that for Adorno, identitarians thinking and exchange relations are isomorphic. In the same way as identity thinking takes away the particular aspects of objects by identifying them with universal concepts, exchange relationships make no identical individuals and performance become commensurable and identical. It's not by chance that the critique of cultural industry in late capitalist society is not about the fact that its products are made by large corporations, but rather it is about how economic relations imprint on them the mark of the whole, which recognize internal procedures in an heteronymous way. To use a famous Adornian formula, the whole is the untruth. This is why Adorno emphasizes how the notion of technique in the products of industry has nothing to do with technique in its proper aesthetic sense. That is, with internal organization of the object itself, with its inner logic. On the contrary, cultural industry lives parasitically from the extra-artistic technique of the material productions of goods, without regard for the obligation to the internal artistic role implied by its functionality, and also without concern for the laws of form demanded by aesthetic autonomy. For its part, Luhmann seems to reject capitalism as a working concept for the description of modern society precisely because its economic-laden nature. In the preface to the differentiation of society, the author states, "We can no longer define society by given by giving primacy to one of its functional domains. It cannot be depicted as civil society, as capitalist or socialist society, or as a scientific technocratic system. We must replace such interpretations by the definition of society that refers to social differentiation. Modern society, unlike all earlier society, is a functionally differentiated system. Its analysis thus requires a detailed study of each of its single functional subsystems. Society can no longer be grasped from a single dominant viewpoint. Instead, its dynamic is clarified through the fact that functional systems for politics, the economy, science, law, education, religion, family, etc., have become relatively autonomous and now mutually furnish environments for one another. What seems to be interesting here is that for both Adorno and Luhmann, capitalism seems to be connected to identity thinking and the primacy of the economic. At the same time, it is obvious that while no identical relationships remain a possibility in Adorno, Luhmann seems to take them as a condition for the emergence of functional differentiation. At least from this very specific perspective, a fully realized functional differentiated society seemed to collide with capitalism conceived in this way. Moving on, among the many varieties of theorization about today's capitalist social formations, it seems that the Foucauldian depiction of them as a new rationality of government, more precisely as neoliberal governmentality, presents some interesting convergence with the type of inquiry that we have been developed so far. Let's briefly look at this. In the birth of biopolitics, based on analysis of the German ordo-liberal tradition and the Chicago School of Economics of the 70s, the French author searched for a specificity in neoliberalism, in contrast to the classical liberal epistemic and social formations. According to Foucault, neoliberal economic thinking breaks with the naive naturalism of 18th century liberalism that sees the market as a given of nature. For the neoliberals, competition is not a natural game between individuals and behaviors. Rather, it is an essential economic logic that will only appear and produce its effects under certain conditions which have to be carefully and artificially constructed. It is precisely this postulate that implies a redefinition of the relation between the market and the state. It can no longer be one of the reciprocal delimitation of different domains, because competition, according to Foucault, which is the sense of the market, can only appear if it is produced, and if it is produced by an active governmentality. From now on, the market is conceived as an organizing and regulating principle of the state. In other words, a state under the supervision of the market, rather than a market supervised by the state. From this, Foucault infers a specific dynamic of neoliberal rationality. That is what most interests us here. I quote, "There will thus be a sort of complete superimposition of market mechanism and governmental policy. Government must accompany the market economy from start to finish. The market economy does not take something away from government. Rather, it indicates, it constitutes the general index in which one must place the rule for defining all governmental action. One must govern for the market rather than because of the market." Another distinctive feature of neoliberal rationality is that it not only leads to remaking of state-market relations, but it extends well beyond into other societal domains and the sphere of subjectivity. According to Foucault, it is about making market regulation a regulatory principle of the whole society. Here is the decisive analytical step. It's a matter of constructing a social fabric in which precisely the basic units would have the form of the enterprise. In other words, what is involved is the generalization of forms of enterprise by diffusing and multiplying them as much as possible. It's a matter of making the market, competition, and so the enterprise into what could be called the formative power of society. This analysis is completed by the presentation of the American case as one of intensifying and radicalizing neoliberal rationality in the direction of the theory of the human capital and the economic analysis of crime. In both situations, neoliberalism is depicted as a grid of intelligibility that seeks to apprehend the internal calculations of human action framed from an economic perspective. That is, whatever the concrete situation, the question is always about how the individual allocates scarce resources, how he or she can manage the resource that they own. In the sphere of the labor, in the relations, the work himself appears as a sort of enterprise for himself. In broader social terms, the whole society appears as a system of corporate units. A new Homo economicus is born, and he or she is an entrepreneur of himself, being for himself his own capital, being for himself his own producer, being for himself the source of his earnings, etc. In radicalized neoliberalism, the American case is crucial in that it entails that analysis in terms of market economy, in other words, of supply and demand, can function as a schema which is applicable to no economic domains. In the words of the French philosopher, it constitutes a sort of economistic analysis of the no economic. This set of Foucauldian insights on the nature of neoliberal rationality as an art of governing populations and the individual points to some peculiarities of current capitalist formations. Very briefly. First, neoliberal capitalism is not all about commodifications of different social spheres. That is about turning them into commodities to be bought and sold in the market. This seems to apply especially to organizations such as the universities that remain public in a formal legal sense. Thus, it is not all about a set of economic policies, such as privatization and so on. Rather, it is about the remaking of these spheres from the perspective of the competitive enterprise. Second, neoliberal capitalism is about power relations, in that neoliberal rationality is not capable by itself of extending into different social domains. It implies the increasing use of political and legal interventions for producing market-like situations in non-market domains. In this sense, it's not about undifferentiated deregulation and the reduction of the state. In Foucault's words, a minimum of economic interventionism and a maximum of legal interventionism. In the same vein, this legal and political interventionism seems to go well beyond the old conceptions of an external instrumentalization of law and the state. Rather, what seems to be at stake here is the internal reconfiguration of these spheres. Third, especially in tune with the American experience, neoliberal capitalism is about the power-based extension of a normative, practical, and totalizing economic rationality to different societal spheres. In Luhmannian terms, it seems to be about not only the more visible corruptions of the autonomy of various partial systems by the imposition from without of the have-not code of the economic system, but also about spreading the economic procedures and tools of reflections towards different social spheres in more insidious ways. In a similar vein, Wendy Brown has recently been indicating a tendency of de-democratization in Western advanced societies. This regards not only the economization of electoral procedures and practice, but mainly This regards the emptying out of the very political values that once formed the center of the political systems. According to the author, to the extent that neoliberalism is evacuating these ideals and desires from actually existing liberal democracy, de-democratized subjects and subjectivities might be undoing democracy, that is, hauling it out from within. Bearing this in mind, in the next section I will deal also briefly with the case of academic capitalism. In the wake of Max Weber's well-known comparison between the academic and business worlds in his essay Science as Vocation, the notion of academic capitalism was originally coined by Edward Hackett to shed light on the growing rapprochement between university research and business, especially in the fields of hard science and engineering. The notion was developed and expanded by Slaughter and Leslie and has become a privileged object of international research. According to Hackett, the notion tries to capture the ways in which capital influences the structure, conduct, and substance of research. In its contemporary phase, the phenomenon acquires comprehensive and diversified contours, ranging from the constitution of industrial research parks and technology transfer offices, the enclosure of publicly produced knowledge in trademarks and patents, to the commercialization of research activities through the purchase of research and the content of publications by large economic conglomerates. The case of the global pharmaceutical industry is exemplary in this regard. It comprises also a broad organization change that redefines the division of academic labor between teaching and research, brings about new criteria for hiring and allocating material and human research, and constitutes new organizational forms such as foundations and public-private partnerships with universities. It's a process of restructuring university in the mirror of the restructuring process carried out in the corporate world. Through a dense network of think tanks and multilateral organizations, it has been spreading throughout different regions and sectors of the global society. Still according to Hackett, through this quiet academic revolution, the academic enterprise becomes increasingly dependent on allocations of capital from without and on the accumulation of capital within. In the process, according to the author, it seeks freedom, purpose, and the ability to act as an independent moral force in society. Slaughter and Les use the term to define the way public research universities are responding to neoliberal tendencies to treat higher educational policy as a subset of economic policy. In this policy environment, faculty and professional staff increasingly must extend their human capital stocks in competitive environments. The implication is that some university employees are simultaneously employed by the public sector and are increasingly autonomous of it. According to the authors, they are academics who act as capitalists from within the public sector. They are state-subsidized entrepreneurs. Academic capitalism comprises both market-like behaviors that refer to institutional and faculty competition for monies, and market behaviors that refer to for-profit activity in the strict sense. In this way, the notion of academic capitalism seems to indicate the varied ways through which a process of neoliberal governmentalization is remaking the contemporary universe, not only through the operations directly oriented to extract profit from academic practice, but also and decisively through the fine-grained tuning operations of remaking procedures and tools of reflection in the mirror of the corporate world. In this respect, Stephen Ball stresses the importance of apprehending neoliberal academic reforms in terms of a new imaginary that has at its center the market as a basis for the universalization of market-based social relations. According to the author, the effect in this new regime is that educational policy is being done in new locations, on different scales, and by different actors and organizations. Ball shows that the instilling of new sensibilities and values into the practice of the public sector is done through performativity, the quintessential form of neoliberal governmentality. It demands the redesign of organizations, organizational relationships, and organizational ecologies. Performativity is both individualizing and totalizing. It produces both an active docility and depthless productivity. It's composed of audits, inspections, appraisals, self-reviews, quality assurance, research assessments, output indicators, and so on. This economic saturation of the university world implies also that other imaginaries are increasingly being marginalized. According to Stephen Ward, neoliberal rationality seems to superimpose academia and capitalism in distinguished ways. Two of these are worth indicating. First, the rationalization of university managerial practice brought about by the importation of new public management into the administration of universities. And second, the creation of schemes that generate student choice, consumerism, and responsibilization. The university that is now emerging in the work of these neoliberal reforms looks and feels quite different from the liberal university that preceded it. Unlike the liberal university, the neoliberal university is reconfigured to both act like a competitive enterprise in the marketplace and to serve the always shifting interests of the market. In the worst case scenario, according to Stephen Ward, the end result of actually existing neoliberalism is a worst of all worlds situations where a market authoritarianism or a kind of illiberal liberalism prevails. Here, all previous social and political checks and balances on markets are essentially released. Well, moving to the final section. We can systematize what has been said so far as follows. First, the presence of some normative motives in Luhmannian system theory, especially in a Weberian ideal-typic conceptual sense. Second, an internal connection between Adorno's critique of identity thinking and Luhmannian emphasis on the reconceptualization of systems as a non-identity between system and environment. Third, neoliberal rationality as a normative totalizing project aimed at extending competition and enterprise values to different social spheres, with a potential for eroding their immanent meaning constellation. Fourth, academic capitalism as a case of the peculiar extension of neoliberal rationality to the university organizations. Taking into account these premises, I will briefly make some methodological observations regarding the importance of conducting empirical research oriented by systemic concepts, especially in relation to a critique of neoliberal rationality and academic capitalism. The first thing is to be prepared to some degree of heterodoxy. In my view, the worst type of research would be the procedure of merely applying conceptual rules to concrete cases. In turn with the critical reading proposed above, conceptual tools are not to be taken as being in exact correspondence with empirical reality. In the tradition of both critical theory and the Weberian ideal types, the gaps between conceptual formation and reality constitute a strategic space for reflection, either in the direction of immanent critique or in the direction of accounting for mixed social formations. There seems to be always something that escapes the conceptual grid, and to show how this happens in concrete situations would be one of the main tasks of empirical research. Second, in relation to other hegemonic theoretical perspectives, systems theory seems to present at least one decisive comparative advantage. The emphasis on functional differentiation and systems autonomy implies a notable deepening of our understanding of the internal workings of different social spheres. Whatever the scope of the empirical research, this should be taken into account in the reconstruction of empirical reality, even if the conceptual constellation is to be used in a negative way. As I said before, as an analytic map of process of differentiation, systems, corruptions, etc. Third, and accordingly, emphasis should be placed on the internal workings of different systems, that is, on reflexive procedures and reflexive theories. After all, systems are observing systems, both observing and being observed. How a system produces observations and descriptions should be a major concern for empirical research, as well as the indication of gaps between concept and reality in this production. As to the spreading of neoliberalism, this seems to be crucial for illuminating the totalizing nature of the semantics. Fourth, and in line with the Adornian connections mentioned above, different social spheres could be refocused as force fields in which opposing tendencies of differentiation and de-differentiation conflate. Empirical investigations on systems dynamics could contribute to shed light on the specific nature of these tensions, especially in concrete situations under process of neoliberal remaking. Research should be able to account for tendencies of systems autonomy erosion and resistance to them. Regarding a specific case of academic capitalism, it seems to me that empirical research could decisively contribute to the elaboration of a critical diagnosis of the contemporary university. Research could attempt to account for some conceptual-oriented questions, and I will simply indicate some of them in a rather preliminary way. First, to what degree tendencies of economic colonization could be attributed to the fact that state policies and reforms in the academic world have been formulated mainly from the perspective of the economic rationality and by non-academic actors. How does the restructuring of universities' internal hierarchy in the mirror of the corporate world affect day-to-day teaching and research practice? A second set of questions: how does the emphasis on productivity, rankings, evaluations affect the core functions of the educational and the scientific systems? How does this emphasis translate into the inner dynamics of research and pedagogical routine? In what ways does the new semantics of an entrepreneurial subjectivity inform pedagogical and research activities? And finally, a third set of questions: how do tendencies of economic colonization relate to different levels of systems self-referentiality? Beyond the extreme situations of corruptions of the system's codes, by which mechanism does economic reason spread into the levels of reflexive procedures and reflexive theories? Would it be possible in concrete situations to speak of weak autopoiesis, by which I mean the maintenance of the allocation of the code at the basal level and the simultaneous erosions of the system's capacities for reflections? Well, there seems to be a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for a conversation between the professors, but I would like to open for questions of the audience. If you could come here to make the question, it's better to report.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for the lecture. It was really good. I would like to have a question. I have a question for you, Ms. Bettina. Sorry. I was very interested in your research. I am studying environmental law, and the connection between law and science is one of my main concerns in my study. And I would like to know exactly, considering the Brazilian context that we live in, we are now at a government which, under your explanation, I can consider it as a populist government, as you said. And when you said, when you were talking about the importance of constructing knowledge as an organization process, I was thinking about the Brazilian context. For example, in Brazil we have we had a very well-known scientist in charge of an institute which made the evaluation of deforestation in the Amazon, and he left the institute because of incongruences with the president, and the person in charge now, he said, and I'm actually quoting, he said that global warming is not his thing. He is not in his field, and he's in charge of a very important institute for that matter. And so I was thinking regarding this organizational way to construct knowledge. How can it work in a populist government in which they actually don't believe in science, for that matter? Thank you.
It's a very fundamental question. I'm not quite sure if I've got all of the answers to that. And I think, of course, it's interesting to see that in a number of different countries we've seen attempts from political administrations to influence kind of who's at the head of an agency. I think there's similar parallels with the appointment of people heading the US Environmental Protection Agency, for example. So it's unfortunately a sort of development that we see in different countries about governments seeking to interfere there as well. I think one of the first things that comes into my mind as well on kind of how we can maintain a degree of healthy autonomy in academic research, and this being overtaken by either very distinct political rationalities, certain economic neoliberal rationalities, is there's something I think quite specific where one can protect researchers' freedom, and that's really the kind of questions we're asking. So I think in some of the very specific tactics, strategies of power, where we can try to enshrine in procurement policies, for example, for projects that are being funded, or that people perhaps in other levels and lower levels of the administration now being sort of led by somebody who has maybe a very particular take on the role of science. If you can preserve the freedom of people who are working at the coalface of collecting data and generating knowledge claims in science, if you can protect the freedom of the formulating of the questions, really, I think that's a quite crucial lever in order to protect academic freedom. That is sort of more perhaps from the academic research side than the research as well that is going on, say, in regulatory agencies and in more closely government-related agencies. But I think perhaps similar mechanisms as well could be thought of, how they are organizationally, spheres of autonomy are carved out. And in terms of maybe where as well social theoretical support comes from, that this might be possible in quite general terms. I was thinking as well in listening to your lecture kind of on the assertion in Foucauldian thinking that where we have sort of power manifesting itself, we also see often really countervailing resistance, that there's no power without resistance, and I think there's hope in that as well, and that even if there are attempts top-down to control, and perhaps as well Luhmann would tell us perhaps about some of the limitations of that in organizational complex environments, that there are also some spaces to find where some resistance is possible. Maybe another angle of thinking about that is that we live so increasingly really transnational societies, that the pressure as well that comes from global networks and limiting what certain countries are trying to do and influencing what the agencies are doing, and if they become climate skeptics, that in the sort of more global context there are again as well, I think, countervailing pressures to try to steer against that as well. Yeah.
Good evening, Professor. I have a question. It's similar to the last one. You said that one role for the specialist is reducing complexity. Which is the difference of this complexity, this reduction of complexity, and the reduction of complexity of a populist? I know it's different, but it seems to me that the difference is a functional differentiation. So it's a kind of a normative in functional differentiation. You're doing the turning like Tobiner and say, okay, we should protect this, we should protect the occupiers of systems, economy and regulation, law, politics. That is a question. And a second one is, if I'm not mistaken, you are saying that we are creating a kind of regulatory system, we change the code true and false to the code relevant and no relevance. I don't know if the word is that, but two questions.
So I think on the first one, I think it's a really interesting, important point. And to me, I think I agree with the implication of your question. I think there's a significant difference about the complexity reduction that Luhmann was talking about, I would think, in that from a functionalist perspective, he meant in sort of highly functionally differentiated contemporary societies, we just need that for some maintenance of social order. There's a reduction of complexity, and so the noise from the environment helps social subsystems to build up their own structures, so this is how it becomes functional and it works. And it's a reduction of complexity that to me doesn't have a strong normative overtone. It's a reduction of complexity that is simply necessary from the Luhmannian perspective in order to maintain social order, whatever the normative commitments of that social order are, and it's a mechanism of complexity reduction in the environment system relationship, that all that information that comes from an environment is being sort of reduced to the internal system operations, and social subsystems stabilize themselves that way, and that's sort of how a functionally differentiated contemporary society can work and sort of maintain and so forth. But I think the reduction of complexity that I meant in, say, populist politics, they are associated with a very distinct, I think, moral political order. There's certain things we would identify in political terms, small conservatism, as a harking back often to former notions of, or clearly see that in the US, sort of former notions of the greatness of the American nation, for example, and very distinct social mores in terms of backlash against some of the more emancipatory social movements we have seen in society around environmentalist movements, around feminist movements, about gender rights, gay liberation, and so forth. So there, I think, the reduction of complexity we have in sort of populist politics is a very different type of reduction of complexity, in that it's associated with a distinct moral code, a complete narrowing against the notion of plurality, of perspectives that we of course get from the Luhmannian idea of heterarchical social subsistence, where no social subsystem can really take a very dominant or hierarchical position, really. So I would see as well analytically in what they describe and what they're about, very clear difference between these two types of complexity reduction, the more overarching analytical social theoretical notion from Luhmann and a particular empirical political practice currently that we see of a particular type of complexity reduction. The other question was focusing on, yes, the coding. Yeah, so I think, and again, I think that picks up a point that I heard from your lecture, that I think a contribution of empirical research and operationalizing Luhmannian systems theoretical concepts is that empirical research can help to further flesh out some of the more overarching concepts. So we have certain ideas from Luhmannian text on how we can label these codes, but what we often see, I think, in particular empirical context is that we can say more about them, that we can further sub-differentiate them, that there's more happening. And so while truth and non-truth is a key one for scientific knowledge claims, academic scientific knowledge claims, what I try to show in this empirical research on a type of knowledge claims as well, public policy makers and regulators are interested in, are seeking to use, there's something going on well beyond coding on truth and non-truth, but sort of more steered towards utilizability really by a public administration, by a government policy-making department of those knowledge claims, and hence it's the relevance, non-relevance, binary coding that I don't think is a new social subsystem, but I think connects itself to often quite fluid boundary lines at the end between applied research, more pure research, what's going in between there. So I think in that way we can try to capture further differentiations of basic coding in social subsystems and show the further nuances that we can sort of point to in naming and labeling coding.
I had a question for Professor Laurindo, but before, just to add something similar to this last question, you said here that consultants may act as a kind of structural coupling between systems. But in another slide you pointed out that maybe they act more to corrupt systems differentiation than to do this structural coupling, which implies reinforcing systems autonomy. So this is a more general question: how we can differentiate what is structural coupling from what is systems corruption? So we say constitution is a structural coupling between law and politics, but what then is the political corruption of law or the legal corruption of politics? How can we differentiate in empirical case corruption from structural coupling?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think that deserves lots of discussion. I think in the first instance, and I guess that was as well implied by your question, is it makes the case again for empirical research. Because I think we can, in general ways, try to capture and define the difference between structural coupling and the breakdown of the equilibrium in a social subsystem and the disappearing, perhaps, of a differentiated economic sphere and highly planned certain types of economic systems, whatever. So I think there's a starting point, so conceptually how we could define that, but I think the interesting thing is that empirically we might be able to get some convincing differentiations, and we could say perhaps we could have empirical indicators, so qualitative and quantitative data about the strength of the interrelationship of the exchange that goes on there, and if it scores really highly by some empirical measure of a really strong interconnection, then we're maybe moving into the phase of corruption. So I was thinking, for example, about a term that we use in sociology of law as well as a phenomenon of legalization. that we're saying, or in Habermasian terms, that the life world is being taken over by the legal system, that there's so much of a taking over of a particular sphere, maybe of private relationships, contracts, where it becomes so legalized how people engage in contractual relationships, maybe with lots of enforcement of contracts by courts, that we're in the sphere of a social subsystem being taken over, say, economics by law in this example, and we can find empirical indicators of legalization. Equally, maybe we could see situations where the interlinking isn't that strong, that therefore there is no breakdown in the autonomy really of the functional social subsystem, and that we therefore just have what Luhmann would talk about as structural coupling. So yes, a form of limited interchange where the one social functional social subsystem reinterprets what comes from its neighboring social subsystem then in its environment, translates it into its own code, but without the corruption, without the breakdown of the internal structures of the other social subsystem. And so we could empirically probably capture that and say it's not full legalization, but for example, soft law forms of governing could be a way of creating a bridge, say, between the political and economic system, but they don't go as far as really fully legalizing. The example that comes to my mind there is the EU directive, for example, on environmental, social and corporate governance reporting for corporations. That is a very soft obligation that on a comply or explain basis, rather than having, say, criminal law for enforcing it, that if you don't give your audit report on what you're doing environmentally, socially, and corporate governance, you get criminally prosecuted. It's just you would have to explain why you don't have to do it. And so here, that could be, I think, an empirical indicator of it's just structural coupling. It isn't fully moving into the range of things where it's corruption. So to me, your question is really very important, very fundamental, but I think there are ways of trying to get there empirically to make judgments in which situations we have more corruption, in which sense we have sort of just forms of structural coupling.
So there is a kind of contingent normative.
There's
a kind of a contingent
Normativity.
In
this concept of structural coupling.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, and I think it sort of reminds me as well to what you were saying about the value that we have as in normative terms, and I think I would agree with that from Luhmannian thinking about championing the autonomy that comes with a degree of autocratic closure of the subsystem. So yeah, so I think there's a contingent normativity. Yeah, I agree.
Anyone more? So my question for Professor Laurindo is about the concept, Luhmann's critique of capitalism. It's just a critique of the concept of capitalism because it refers to the economic sphere, or it's just a bad concept, capitalism, or is a kind of bad organization for society, implying the dominance of the economic sphere above the other functional systems. We know that the first is more clear at Luhmann's writings, but there is this other implication we can draw from the theory.
That's a very good question. I agree with you in relation to the first aspect. Definitely, Luhmann doesn't buy capitalism as a working concept because of so many different presuppositions in the theory confront this possibility. But I think maybe it would be possible to try some kind of rapprochement between for example, Adornian critical think about capitalism and the superimposition of an economical logic spreading. So, because, let me reformulate it. in the following terms. Capitalism and social capitalist formations, according to some traditions of critical theory, implies both the premise of the economics, colonizations, and tautology. Neither of these elements seems to be compatible with the theoretical framework of Luhmannian system theory. So I think it would be possible to develop, to try to capture and develop some of these tensions that are more.
So we could not simply equate capitalism and functional differentiation, as Bashir does.
No, I disagree completely. Because, precisely because this seems to me a reductionist. It's perfectly possible to take Luhmannian system theory to try to explanation dynamics of tautologies and different formalisms of various kinds. Juridicism, economicism, politicism, scienticism, yet Parnassianism, whatever. But about that, recently I read a brilliant piece by the great writer Luhmann, the physicist. It's brilliant how he captures this expansionist tendency in various spheres. That's one possibility, but I don't think that it tells all the story about the rich tapestry of Luhmannian theoretical model.
So, if no one more wants to talk, someone want to add something, Professor?
I think it's a really interesting question as well that you raised. I wonder if one could think as well, there's a difficulty to sort of reconcile, or that there is a way of saying that capitalism as a concept doesn't sit easily with Luhmannian analysis, but would it fit with the idea kind of that we normatively evaluate it as negatively? And it seems to me the functionalist aspiration in social theory is to look for how social orders are maintained. And if we accept a Marxist critique of capitalism as a form of economic organizing that is inherently crisis-ridden, and it seems to me there's lots of current evidence on how crises are produced in economic systems, in capitalist economic systems, then we could see that if we think empirically that is a correct analysis, that it undercuts the search always for the functional stability that as well a Luhmannian perspective would champion. So from that perspective as well, I'd say for Luhmann, if it is really crisis-ridden, it is just not fitting well in what I think he normatively as well would prefer as the stabilizing possibility of the economic subsystem.
Thank you. I would like to thank again Professor Bettina Lange and Professor Laurindo Minhoto. Thank you of the audience. And I would like to invite you for being with us tomorrow again. We will have some discussions about regulation, law and economy, empirical research with systems theory. And next week we will have on Thursday and Friday Professor Alphonse Bora from Bielefeld to discuss legal sociology with us. So we look forward to meet you again tomorrow or next week in the next sessions of our seminar. Thanks.